Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the first installment of Art Gottlieb's The Cold War Historical Perspective. The first session will be an introduction into this five-part series, along with a talk on Marxism and Leninism, as well as World War I. Now, please give a warm welcome to Art Gottlieb.
Thank you. So I've got no slides for you today. I just wanted to keep this as a general discussion, and it's going to be those of you who've taken my courses before. You know, I lecture and also I stop, as was said, and I want to make sure I'm addressing any questions that people might want to have. And you know, for the people that are here, if you're around my age, you'll certainly remember, as was just discussed in our storytelling. You'll certainly remember personal aspects of the Cold War. And I broke this up into 5 sections, but this is something I could talk about forever. It is a multifaceted, multi-strata discussion having to do with every aspect of everything. And certainly for myself, the backdrop of the Cold War was a daily feature of understanding the world. It was, for me, it was Vietnam, of course. And Vietnam was something that, you know, my father watching the news every night, as he did. And I watched the news too. I mean, even as a child, I mean, sitting on the floor, right, in the hierarchical order of things in our little apartment, I got the floor because I was the youngest, and I watched this crazy little skinny strip of a place called Vietnam and all the rest of it, and it was a complete cultural education, as it turned out to be. And certainly in junior high school and certainly high school, as a young man, now going into his young teenage years. I mean, this war was, back in those days, Vietnam War had exceeded the length of anything. And it was, I'm going to wind up in a rice paddy. You know, that's what I'm going to do. And so young people, you know, 13 years old, are there talking around the cafeteria lunch trays about, well, I'm going to Canada, and well, I'm gonna join the army, and my father was a Marine, and you know, and all of these things. And my older brother, he was like almost 5 years older than me, you know, so it was like looking at this whole thing. And you remember also the context of the 1960s, you know, as far as a cultural revolution as well. You know, I mean, my parents made sure my brother got into college, so he didn't have to, you know, he had a greater chance of escaping the draft system and that sort of a thing. I mean, it had a tremendous effect on everything. And my father was very proud World War II Korean era veteran. And, you know, so he had all of these feelings about what you should do as an American, yet at the same time, he had his questions about the efficacy of the Vietnam War. You know, so this was, you know, something that was just normal conversation, and must have been for a gazillion other people, you know, in similar situations to mine. Now, as a historian, I like to put all of this in context, and that's what this program is about today. So the first program, which is today, I've got a general introduction. I want to understand and have you understand some things about Marxism and Leninism. And then I end with the significance of World War I. For the next one in our program, I delineated it out, Nazism, Marxism, and liberal capitalism, right? And World War II, an unlikely alliance, and that is, of course, between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans. The seeds of the Cold War, which were right there in World War II while we're allies. victory over Germany and Japan, and the implications that that had as far as the Cold War was concerned. The third program on November 2nd, I go into what is famously referred to as the Iron Curtain, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, post-colonialism, and the emerging nationalism, right, which has to do with countries that were always colonized. And then the end of World War II broke that. It started a new era. Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, Kim Il-sung, Pol Pot, and Fidel Castro. For November 16th, the list is proxy wars, one of which I described in the form of Vietnam, the strategic triad, right, which refers to our defense capabilities as far as nuclear weapons were concerned, mutually assured destruction, the most appropriately named acronym I can think of, right, MAD, MAD, the Cold War at home and McCarthyism. And finally, in the last presentation, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, 1989 to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, America as the sole superpower, globalism and postmodern Russia, contemporary relevance of the Cold War. That's it. And of course, if we had twice the time, we wouldn't run out of things to talk about. Not with this one. So, you know, I'm doing current events tonight, right? And well, I call it focus on contemporary issues, okay? And so tonight, that'll be my third presentation tonight. All three things have to do with what we're talking about right now. This morning, I was doing a program on Eleanor Roosevelt, right? Eleanor Roosevelt, you know, running around in the 1920s and the 1930s, you know, the politics of the day, certainly with, as far as Franklin Delano Roosevelt concerned, a lot of people considered it to be, well, we're going to turn into a communist country, right? Because the central government is getting too much power and too much say and the means of production and all the rest of that. And really the whole Roosevelt thing was nothing but a secret communist takeover, right? And a lot of people were scared. They were so scared from what happened in the Soviet Union. We were seeing bugaboos under every desk, you know, about foothold of socialism getting control of our country. And so that was in that program I was doing this morning, as far as it was sort of a soft Cold War, right? What made our Cold War that we were just discussing in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s was the fact that we had all these nuclear weapons pointed at us. But, you know, there was really a Cold War before that, ever since the rise of communism, which uses socialism as a mechanism. That's in Vladimir Lenin's own words, that the purpose of socialism, the purpose is to create a one world socialist style government, which is the ultimate aim as far as Lenin was concerned. And then tonight I'll talk about, during Focus on Contemporary Issues, I'm going to be talking about, you know, the overlap of current affairs with China, et cetera, which is now we're looking at in the standpoint like we didn't before, at least some of us are, about the Chinese Communist Party. And although the Chinese Communist Party has been there for a very long time, obviously, since the 1940s, we didn't really recognize it. You know, when we thought of communism, we really were thinking about Soviet-style communism. In 1991, we had a peace dividend after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellite states and the Warsaw Pact. And I was like, well, who's left to fight? You know, and the assumption was that China was just going to become, we're going to include them in our globalization plans about sort of like this capitalistic production of stuff, materials, and include them into global trade, and they're just going to become like the West, right? And now we're faced with the notion that maybe that didn't happen, and that you're staring down the barrel of a communist country whose military is now more effective than yours is, you see. So all three programs today, even though the topics are diverse, really all are in the category of the Cold War, right? Are we in a new Cold War now? So I talk about Marxism and Leninism. And really, if you've ever read the Communist Manifesto and et cetera, it's a very interesting history. This is a very intellectual, philosophical document. Now, all politics are philosophical, right? And, Karl Marx had envisioned this battle between the proletariat, which was the working class person, right, and the bourgeoisie, which was going to be some kind of, greedy would be the right word, capitalistic type of a person who would actually own the factory and be getting rich off of everyone else's labor. Right. So it was inherently an unfair situation. And the point is that why don't you empower the workers so the workers actually can basically be in a position to say, hey, you know what, without us, you would have no power at all over us. So it is a workers' movement, communism in its essential form. Right. So if there was going to be a revolution that was going to be like this, Marx had envisioned it in the society that he saw it and it coming forward in. It would have to be an industrial society where there was a real blue collar working class, people who were toiling every day in these unsafe, unhealthy factories, making these fat cats rich, right? And that would be Germany. Right, because Germany embodied that in the late 19th century, as did the United States of America, by the way. Those were the two real countries. The Great Britain was responsible for the first industrial revolution. The second industrial that had to do with basically like steam transportation and that sort of a thing. But the second industrial revolution really belonged to the newly formed Germany and the up and coming post-Civil War United States. You see, so it was very unlikely, a surprise really, to true communists that what was to become known as the Bolshevik Revolution, ushering communism eventually in Russia, that it would happen in a society that was essentially an agrarian rural society. Right? Communism was supposed to take place in an industrialized urban society, you see? And that's why places in Germany and places like the United States and places in Great Britain were always waiting for the other shoe to drop and say, well, it's ripe to happen in our industrialized society because that's where Marx always envisioned it happening. You see, it was really kind of strange that it actually took root in Russia, you see. And this has a lot to do with World War II. If you study World War II, and you understand really what Hitler was all about. And what Hitler was all about was like 100% race. Everything with him started with race, everything. Right? Everything was reduced down to a racial argument. And it was the basis of what he wanted to do and why he wanted to do it. It's all in Mein Kampf, literally verbatim. It's just one of those things that nobody bothered reading. It was kind of like, well, that's for his base. And, these people always talk like that. They don't really mean it. Well, it turns out that he really did mean it, of course. And the point about Russia was concerned and communism was concerned. There was no greater enemy to communism than Hitler, and strangely enough, here in the United States, a little bit of a blind eye was turned to Hitler because Hitler served a purpose. And what was that purpose? Because he hated communism so much that maybe we'll not see Hitler as the worst thing that he really is, because he's actually serving a purpose. And that is that he's going to create a bulwark in Europe against communism. See how this all ties in? And, of course, why did Hitler hate communism so much? I mean, he himself became a fascist, and which is an economic, governmental type of approach to running a country that he borrowed from the person who invented it, which was, of course, Mussolini, who invented fascism. And Hitler looked at the Russians and the communist system in Russia as a product of a Jewish mind, right? Which is effectively it was. I mean, if you want to look at it in that way. And that's the way Hitler looked at it. Now, if you were to say to Karl Marx, hey, I hear you're Jewish, he would laugh right in your face. The guy was raised like a Lutheran or something, you know? But the thing to understand about Adolf Hitler was that he would look at Judaism not as a religion, he saw it as a biological race. You see, that was Hitler's thing, right? So if you see something as a biological race, then in the rage of the time of the 1930s, you had what was the intellectuals' theory du jour, which was Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, and eugenics, you see? So if you have a biological race, and Darwin says that obviously some races or some bloodlines are superior to others, then we make the argument that people are of different bloodline might be inferior to us, or we're superior to them. And that was the whole thing with Hitler, right? They were the Aryans, and Jews were a substandard drag on society and the world in general, right? And they deserve to be treated as second-class citizens, of course. And all this was in the service of this fantastic prejudice, of course, right? And but the thing is, you got to make it sound scientific, and therefore you're not really a racist, you're just following science. You see, that's what Hitler was doing, right? And there were enough people around who didn't like Jews anyway, so we're kind of like, yeah, I could see that, you know. So we have a few less Jews. What's the problem? And the thing is that since Karl Marx was historically, his family was original from Jewish roots. For Adolf Hitler, Karl Marx, despite the fact that he considers himself a Christian or an atheist, he's Jewish, right? There's no not being Jewish, you know? If you have Jewish blood in you, boom, that's it, you see? And so Hitler saw the Soviet Union as a bastardization of an entire country by this Jewish international cabal. And so Hitler was going to not invade Russia in 1941, because he was an aggressive warlike figure. He was going to liberate the country from the Jews who would impose communism on them, because Jews created some system of subjugation of the Slavic people. You see, I mean, so you see how all of this becomes twisted and used for, this is what in psychology we call a rationalization, you know, when you find some reason to do this twisted thing that you just did, and you say, yeah, well, now it's okay, right? And all of that, of course, is alive and well, as you darn well know, all right? So Marxism and Leninism becomes the standard in Russia, right? You ever see Dr. Zhivago? I mean, it's a hell of a thing, you know? I mean, you know, it's done very well, obviously. It's a dramatic movie. It's a wonderfully acted movie, right? And it's basically the entire society had shifted into this centralized control, where everybody who used to be considered a person and had certain, I don't know, expected rights as a person, as an individual, all of that didn't matter all of a sudden. You were just a subservient thing to some larger thing, you see? So you couldn't get an ideology that would be more opposite than what our founding documents gave the American citizen. You see what I mean? And it really created a very, very dramatic, from the get-go, it created a very dramatic example of who we are vis-a-vis who the communists are, right? And for the period of time, certainly when I was growing up and before that, you could identify, one of the things that helped identify and unify Americans was that we were us and they were them, you see? Since the fall of the Soviet Union, we don't have that go-to example anymore. You see, to say part of what defines us as us is that we're not them, right? Them doesn't exist anymore. After 1991, them ceased to exist, you see? And I think that even to a little degree, maybe more than a little degree, our identity that was a collective thing that we understood about each other, no matter what our individual differences were, was that went away, that went away. Because communism turned the state government into the ultimate authority, right? Kind of like Nazism, you see, except in Nazism, it wasn't the stated effect. In communism, it was the de facto means. It was the state government was the ultimate authority, right? And even though you had people who were practicing religion in Russia and in the Soviet Union, they were generally speaking oppressed and chased around and terrible tiny minorities. In other words, it was God had been replaced by the state government, you see. And for us, for most of our existence in the United States, up until probably around 30, 40 years ago, we had a very mainstream belief, a public open belief in some kind of monotheistic religion, most notably Protestantism, certainly Catholicism, and thirdly, but not most influentially, Judaism, you see. So that belief in this monotheistic God in our founding documents made God the central authority and made people subservient to God. And it was people who created government, which made government subservient to God, right? And that couldn't be 180 degrees different between the us versus them thing, you see? We had a higher authority that exceeded government. And for the Soviet Union and those like the Soviet Union, no, the state was the ultimate authority, right? And I think that for us culturally in the last, like I said, 30, particularly, but 40 years, now, I mean, the average kind of people that you would see on the street who openly talk about their Christianity or their belief in Jesus or whatever it might be, I mean, those people are hiding in the shadows now, you see, and with it, that and our more secular society, it is naturally, you've kind of gone into, well, maybe our government should have the say of how things should be done. And government is kind of in recent years taken the place of our seeking to have some kind of authority in our lives, you see. A lot of changes have happened, right? So we used to have this big difference between communism and our country, and it gave us a collective identity that we had God in our society, that we were subservient to not only God, but government was subservient to God. And in the Soviet Union, it was the state. And the state said this, and everybody had to fall into line. That was something that was a big difference between them and us. And at the end of World War I, right, Russia left the First World War, right, 1917. That was it. We're done. And they kind of like went inward, and they went on and they had their Bolshevik revolution, see? And it was a big turning point in world events. Right? World War I in general was in a lot of regards. Before World War I, you still had this different world order where you had these long-standing monarchies, right, and including in Russia, and the Russians, the French, the English, right? All of these other, Prussians and everything else like that, the Austrians, Serbia, all of these places had these royal families, etc. And the history of that kind of sovereignty of a ruler would be that the sovereign ruler, right, the king, the queen, were actually descended from divinity itself, you see? And World War I blew all of that to smithereens, right? Everything that still remained as a monarchy after World War I, like, for instance, the British Empire, okay, and the British monarchy more specifically, was there almost as in a kind of it was a suggestion. It wasn't quite as authoritarian as it was. You see, World War I had changed the entire world order. And as it specifically relates to communism, the point I want to make about this is that a great example of post-World War I would be, I've got two examples, right? One, what happened here in the United States, which was we went into this, we kind of threw ourselves a party after World War I, and it was the Roaring 20s, and it was a pretty big deal. And we had this, I mean, if you think about it, I did a program the other day on Coney Island, and the interesting thing was I found these like really old photographs, and the 1890s, 1900, right up to like 1908, etc. And even on the beach at Coney Island, these women were dressed in these ridiculous outfits from like their chin down to their toes, and you couldn't let like an inch of skin be shown, or else it was scandalous. Very extremely puritanical and all the rest of that, right? But meanwhile, in a very short amount of time, right, then I do a program on the flapper era, and you got these pictures of women in 1922 who are, wearing these equivalent of these beaded miniskirts, right, and these low cut tops, etc. Doing these crazy suggestive dances, exhibiting what was perceived at the time to be like wanton animal instincts. I mean, how did you go from one extreme like that to the other? And that was only short-lived. I mean, by the end of the 1920s, after the onset of the stock market crash and the Great Depression, I mean, things became more conservative again. But after World War I had a tremendous effect on the entire Western world. It was devastating. You had lost generations of men and people. It was the first time that civilian populations were bombed from the air, okay, even though those instances were relatively isolated. And it was all war. It was total war. You had modern weapons that were doomsday weapons, like the machine gun, right? The people who invented the machine gun, the modern machine gun, which was perfected by World War I, said that this is going to end war, right? Because the fact of the matter that you could mow down people as fast as you could shoot bullets automatically on automatic fire. I mean, it's like people are like, well, this is insane now. Nobody could win. So it was a doomsday weapon, but it didn't end anything. All it meant was that you were going to have 10,000 casualties in one single day. And it's unbelievable, you see? And so the people who were injured during World War I, the people who were half blown to bits but not dead, they survived the war in these grossly disfigured fashion. The psychological trauma is something that can't even be estimated, right? And the effects on the secondary and tertiary family relations of somebody who was traumatized, right, or that has PTSD, as we would call it today. The effects of this are practically inestimable, okay? Leading right up into our lives, right? Because World War I wasn't that long ago. My grandfather was in World War I, okay? Excuse me for a second, would you? Now, Weimar Germany is something that, we usually talk about in the context of like something that was making Hitler insane, right? Because it wasn't bad enough for Hitler that Germany had lost World War I, right? But what he saw around him, Hitler, in Germany in the 1920s, right, by this democratic government, was that traditionalism was being thrown out the window in favor of this modern expression in every facet of society and architecture, art, architecture, society, social mores, and it horrified Hitler. And that's the point, is that why did you have this rise of this expressionism that was so anti-traditional in the 1920s, right? You have Cubist paintings, you've got Picasso, right? And you've got buildings that are of the international style, very modern, all kinds of modern art, you see? Why the break with traditionality that became so apparent in the 1920s? The answer is because it's a psychological issue. It's a socio-psychological issue. It is World War I had completely broken the back of anyone's fantasy that what you were fighting for in World War I made sense, you see? Because obviously it didn't make sense because it went straight to the point of insanity. World War I was insanity. It was insanity, and it drove everybody insane. And so the 20s were an expression of that, well, of everything we were taught to believe in that made sense isn't really something that you should believe in because it was actually insane or meaningless, then why am I adhering to it? You see? And people they broke from everything. They broke from the king, they broke from the queen, they broke from anything that was traditional, that they had taken for granted, had long-standing value before World War I, was thrown away after World War I, because it was such a devastating experience that nothing meant anything. And you might as well start from scratch. And the pendulum completely swung into a post-traditional society, you see? So from the societies that you had that were, I don't know, like in England, for instance, it's a monarchy, it's a parliamentary monarchy, right? And other places. Communism was very, very ripe in Germany in the 1920s, because what communism said was, and that was the big opposition party to the Nazi party, by the way, in Germany in the 1920s, going into the 1930s. And once Hitler became chancellor in 1933, he got rid of the communists, right? Because he made himself the dictator, which is another story I could tell you if you want to hear it. And how he did that. It's actually a very good story for today's sensibilities. The communists said, obviously, to people who were educated and smart people, and people in Germany were, communism looked and they said, the intelligentsia said to Germany, so tell me, how is that Western capitalism working out for you? Okay. Not only have you guys tried to destroy the world, right? Because capitalism, as far as the communists were concerned, it was capitalism that was the root cause of World War I. right? And this is why I'm starting slowly here with this one, because it's important to understand this, right? According to Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, capitalism is actually the real danger of the world, because capitalism is driven on profit, right? Greed, you see? And World War I fit right into that narrative. You see, how so? In World War I, the United States was producing arms like crazy, guns, bullets, you name it. And who were we selling it to? Anybody who wanted to buy it. You see, we weren't in the war, but we don't care. Come and buy as many hand grenades as you want. Come and buy as many bullets as you want. You see? So according to Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto, we actually walked right into something that he said that capitalism is guilty of. And in this case, it kind of seems like it's accurate, that we don't care who kills who, as long as we're making a profit, you see? And therefore, we are unprincipled, and we have no values, and we have no morals except for greed. You see, so if you get rid of capitalism, you get rid of greed, and you get rid of the desire to actually buy and sell bullets. And therefore, because we want to sell bullets, we are going to be promoting wars where they wouldn't already exist, for the sole purpose of us getting rich selling weapons. You getting this? This is what Karl Marx said back in the 19th century. You could have the same conversation right now, you see? And after World War I, a lot of people looked at communism and they looked at Karl Marx, because this established world order and the World War I was obviously insane. It had broken the back on this commitment to thinking that our traditional ways of thinking of things in our respective Western countries was unassailable, and you had to constantly think about it in terms of, what we're doing as a nation. You see, World War I broke the back of that. So in other words, you turn the page and you say, well, that was insane. Maybe we can find another way of running our lives and running our government and running the world order, because we can't have another World War I. You see, and that's where Karl Marx came in, right at that point. Not him, but the Communist Manifesto, and say, hey, you see that? If you were a communist nation, none of this would have happened, you see? Because World War I was the result of all of the greedy people, like the people in the United States, you see, who don't care who kills each other. As a matter of fact, they hope you all kill each other, because they'll get richer. You see? So if you get rid of capitalism, you won't have another world war. That's why that was the period of the first Red Scare. And you took a position here in the United States, and you knew that it was possible that the communists were actually making sense. And we are going to wind up being a communist nation, not just because of World War I, but that was the foot in the door. The second opening of the door was obviously the stock market crash of 1929, you see? So if you were somebody in 1932, right, during the Hoover administration, and you were like, okay, well, we've got our freedoms and we've got our system of government, and we have, let the free market take care of it, Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? I mean, how's that working out for you? Well, I'm starving to death, and so is my family, thank you very much. My father, who has 2 degrees and fought in World War I, is now selling apples on the corner. You see, so communism advertised itself as a solution to all of this. The problem is that the people at the top were so greedy that they invested wrong, because they didn't care about anybody but themselves. The whole thing was a bubble and it popped. And now all of you proletariats got screwed. So if you get rid of capitalism and you install our system where everybody is equal, right? It'll pull down the top of those greedy people who invested over their heads because they were so drunk with their greed, they didn't care what happened. You'll pull them down and resources will be distributed so that the people at the bottom won't get screwed anymore. You see? That was what communism said. And hey, you know what? In 1932, that was looking pretty good. And our depression translated into the depression overseas, right? Because Germany became extremely dependent on American bank involvement so they can pay their reparations payments to the crazy Treaty of Versailles, which essentially forced Germany to admit that the entire World War was their fault, and they had to pay these enormous cash payments, right? That was particularly France that did that. And once we had our Great Depression and our banks failed, we could no longer pay Germany. So we couldn't loan them the money anymore, so they could pay France. And then Germany's economy completely collapsed, you see? And right at that point, you've got the Communist Party in Germany, right? Which was saying, see that? How's that Western democracy working for you? We're all starving to death here. You see, now's the time that Germany should flip to being communist, you see? And that was a pretty big deal. It's one of the things that actually created the Nazi Party, you know, as far as their fear of, you know, what was going to happen with a communist takeover in Germany. Hitler put himself in a position where he was going to counteract that. And he did, actually. And then when he became chancellor in 1933, he had actually consolidated power after the death of the president, Hindenburg. And he de facto he invented a new term called the Führer, right, which is essentially the dictator of the country. And what he created was the Reichstag fire, which was like our Capitol building. So Hitler's own people staged this fire inside the Reichstag, and they burned the place down. And it becomes such an outrage that our symbol of national government was burned down. Well, who did it? Well, of course, and this was part of the plot, it was the communists, see? And so it gave Hitler the opportunity to call effectively a national emergency and turned it into a police state because of this staged burning of the Reichstag, where he could now imprison those who were accused of creating the Reichstag fire, the communists. So these were the first inhabitants of Hitler's concentration camps were the communists. And then Hitler turned around and took every single communist newspaper and every person who was in the party, and he imprisoned them and shut them down. And then he had complete absolute power. And he used the Reichstag fire to do it, which they actually set themselves. So it's a famous story. So I'm going to stop right now and ask you if you have any questions or any thoughts, or if there's anything particularly you want to know, either about what I just said or in the future for the sake of this course. Nothing? Either I'm doing a good job or I've put you all asleep. So anyway, this delusionment after World War I, that's something that usually doesn't come up in conversation or in actual stories. World War I made people's minds explode. It changed everything. Everything we believed in, everything we assumed was true was out the window as just garbage. We're starting from scratch. Give me a new way to think about the world, you see? It was one of the biggest hinge points in Western modern history, okay? Now, we have, fast forward to World War II, right? Brings us Russia now, the Soviet Union, signing a non-aggression pact with the Nazis. Well, how is that possible? I thought they hated each other. Well, they do, right? But you know, people make strange bedfellows here, you see? So Stalin had wanted to buy time because he saw obviously that World War II was about to happen. And now Stalin, right, the Soviet dictator, okay, the avowed communist, he was, like many people in the position that he was in, was kind of paranoid and kind of isolated and surrounded by sycophants. And he didn't really trust anybody anymore, right? Because people are always vying for power. And he had purged his entire military. It was like having an army without any leadership, you know, and he needed more time. So he cuts this deal with Ribbentrop, right, the foreign minister of Germany. And he says it's a non-aggression pact, which means that, okay, Germany, do what you're going to do, and we, the Russians, aren't going to stop you. And you, the Russians, you do whatever you're going to do, and we, the Germans, aren't going to stop you. And really what this was about was, A, to give Stalin more time to put his military back in shape, okay? And B, it was about Poland, right? Poland has always been in this terribly unfortunate place in between Germany and Russia, right? Which were historically two dangerous places, right? And so, of course, Stalin knew that when Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the point was in this non-aggression pact, which was Russia was not going to intervene through the eastern part of Poland as a buffer to the Germans, right? So the Russians were going to hands off, let the Germans take Poland, and as a payoff for not intervening, right, even to protect themselves on the eastern part of Poland, once Poland was captured, then Russia got half of Poland. That was it. And that's exactly what happened. But now World War II was on with Britain and France against Germany, but Russia's not in the war yet. But communist Russia is de facto allies with Germany. And then as soon as Hitler had gained what he wanted in the West, which was the capture of the continent, he turned his attention to the real point of the war, which I was getting at earlier, was the conquest of Russia. You see, and the reason why Hitler wanted to conquer Russia, was that the Russians, well, they deserved to be liberated after all, because the country under communist rule was under this crazy Jewish plan of communism to take over the country, you see, which they did during the Bolshevik Revolution. So Hitler really was an ideological war to rid and liberate the Russians from this cabal of crazy communist Jews that were running the country. And of course, it's all in Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf said that really what Hitler wanted was living room in the East, right? Expansion room. So you needed a subservient people, and the anti-Semitism was really a rationalization to do it. And so in 1941, Operation Barbarossa was the invasion of the Soviet Union, you see, which was the real point of the war for Hitler, you see. Hitler didn't really feel like he wanted to be at war with particularly the British, right? Hitler always hoped that the British would come to their senses and join the war with their fellow, or at least cousin Aryans, against the real enemy, the Jewish Russians. Anything? Any thoughts, comments? Meanwhile, in the United States, where, like I said, there's a communist under every, hidden under every potted plant. There's a communist, because it seemed appealing, especially to intelligent people, right? Intelligent people, they would see them in themselves, this intelligent answer. And how is it that in the 20th century we're still acting upon our animal instincts of wanting to protect ourselves in tribes and nation states, and then which constantly means that you have to protect yourself and go to war, right? Wouldn't it be great if we did have a one world where we're all in peace and everyone is under this rulership where basically, since there's no material things to own, then there won't be any personal animosity. So it's not like I've got a bigger car than yours and you're jealous of me, and then you're going to go out and do capitalistic things that's going to harm the world to make more money. So you can actually get a car that's like mine. You see, if we all were issued the same car, there'd be no more competition. And if there's no competition, then there's nothing to fight about. If you got religion, there'd be nothing to fight about ideologically. You see, it would be the end of avarice. It would be the end of greed. It would be the end of ambition. It would be the end of everything that causes trouble between people. You see, so at the end of World War I, all of this seemed darn plausible, right? Why don't we just get rid of all of these nation states where we're constantly like, well, we're the Belgians and we're the French and we're the English and we're the Germans, and we have to defend ourselves and build a navy and protect our currency and all the rest of that. If you got rid of all of that and everything was the same, then according to Marxism, there would be nothing left to fight about. Now, if you're an intelligent person, if you're I don't know, if you're looking towards the future in this bright, positive way, where you're saying, well, we're so smart as human beings that we should find a way to make war obsolete, well, this is your answer. And that has always been the appeal of it. But it's not the truth of it, you see, it's the appeal of it. So the criticism of intellectual people who get lost in this kind of, this kind of spaciness of it is that they don't have their feet on the ground, and they don't really see that the communist countries as they have existed up to this point, at least in history, have been filled with greed and corruption and everything else like that. And the answer to that has always been, well, it's never been done right. And since we'll implement it and we're smarter, we're going to do it right this time. You see, so it is a constant thing that renews itself, because the promise of wishing that there was nothing left to fight about or no need for weapons is something that appeals to people, right? See, so the whole thing is like tremendously philosophical, idealistic, right? Ideological, you see, and we're up to our eyeballs in it right now, as people have been always. It's just a different time at a different place with different technology. Any thoughts? All right.
Where does Italy fit into this?
When?
During the Second World War, or before the Second World War?
Before the Second World War, you had Italy was at the forefront of fascism. It was Hitler who looked towards Mussolini like a mentor. The thing is, we think about World War II and we think about Mussolini as this kind of like, somebody riding the coattails of Hitler. It was actually the opposite, right? Mussolini was the big cheese as far as the post-World War I dictator, as fascism was, right? He had the black shirts and all the rest of these things. It was really the forerunners of the Nazi Party. And Hitler looked at Mussolini and he was like tagging around with the guy, like, please take me with you, you know? And of course, what happened during the war was that Mussolini was always writing checks he couldn't cash. I mean, his idealism and bravado exceeded the actual discipline of his armed services and their ambition. You know, wars are fought with will, and you know the Italians just weren't really into it. They went along with it, but they weren't really into it. You know, so Mussolini's fantasy in the 1930s was he was going to recreate the Roman Empire, right? And so therefore he wanted the entire Mediterranean basin, right? He wanted the Balkans, he wanted Italy, he wanted the Mediterranean as an Italian lake, he wanted North Africa, right? He invaded Abyssinia, which was Ethiopia. And what happened, he kind of got stranded down there. And that's why the Germans in World War II had to go down into Greece and had to go into North Africa. It's not that Hitler wanted to be in Greece or North Africa. Hitler had to rescue the Italians. And that's why he was down there, right? And that's why you had the Africa Corps in North Africa, right? And you had all of that other stuff in you know, the areas to the east of Italy, etc. And then, of course, the Allies counter-invaded in 1942, which was our first joint operation with the British after the invasion of Pearl Harbor, right? And so this took till November of 1942, because the plan was that we are going to have it's going to be a Europe first policy, right? So, you know, the Pacific's going to have to wait while we dig in Europe. And Pacific was going to have to operate on a shoestring. And so Operation Torch, which occurred in November of 1942, was a joint operation between us and the British. And General Patton landed in Casablanca, right? And the British went through the Straits of Gibraltar and landed in Libya. And then basically what we were going to do was we were going to pincer Rommel out of North Africa, which is what happened, basically. You know, we were going to take Patton coming in from the West with the Americans and the British coming out of Egypt, and we were going to squeeze Rommel out of Africa, which eventually happened, you see. And then from there, we jumped across the Mediterranean to Sicily, and then from Sicily to the boot of Italy, and then up Italy. And then at that point in 1943, what happened was the Italians were like, that's it, we're done. And the people running Italy, they threw out Mussolini, they imprisoned him. And the country became a neutral country. In other words, de facto, an ally of the Allies, you see. So they had flipped on the Germans, you see. And Mussolini had actually become an ally of the Germans after the fall of France, when it became sure that Hitler actually had that kind of juice to actually make France capitulate. You know, so from right after the fall of France, Mussolini joins the war on the side of Germany, declares war on the United States and the other allies. You see, but in 1943, it was all over for Italy, and the Germans treated the Italians very punitively. Because essentially they had the psychological factor of betrayal, you see. I used to work with this guy named Mr. Spompanato, right? And he was this very cultured guy, right? Very cultured guy. And it was his job. He was there and he was the protocol director at the Intrepid, right? Protocol director, right? And I was there to meet dignitaries and all kinds of things. And he was the one, Mr. Spompanato, who took me around and he showed me the proper way about a big round table, right? To how to greet people and who got greeted first and who got greeted second and what you're supposed to say and what you're not supposed to say. I mean, it was quite fascinating, you know, it was quite fascinating. But the thing was, Mr. Spompanato, is he was a prisoner of war, of the Germans in Italy in World War II. And they treated the Italians terribly because they had flipped on the Germans, right? They betrayed the Germans. And, you know, we were at a lot of these expensive dinners and things like that. I mean, I spent a lot of time with Mr. Spompanato, right? We're all wearing tuxedos, right? And the sight of carrots would take this dignified man, it would make him crazy. The sight of carrots. Carrots. Why? Because it's all the Germans would give them to eat. It was really something, right? And I asked him, I said, what is it with the carrots, Mr. Spompanato? And he told me this whole story. He says, when I was a prisoner of war, this heavy Italian accent, when I was a prisoner of war, the Germans, they wouldn't give us anything to eat but carrots. And it traumatized him forever. Interesting stuff, right? Anyway, so as for what does that have to do with the communists? I don't know, but it is, you know, that's the story of, you know, Italy. You asked me about Italy, you know, certainly in the 1930s, right, into the 1940s. You know, as far as Russia was concerned, Russia was always working on the playbook that it was going to follow Lenin's maxim that the purpose of communism is to ensure worldwide socialism, right? As a matter of fact, that was such an important thing. If you look at in the 1939 World's Fair, right, the Russian exhibit, right, like, you know, they have these big countrywide exhibits, you know, and it was a big, you know, bas relief of Lenin, you know, that one with the side of his face with the, you know, the look on his face. That was the quote that they used. And they're saying that our goal, the purpose of our government, the entire communist experiment has no purpose other than to ensure the eventual worldwide government in a socialist way. You see? So this is nothing new. It has always been there. So you have people who are playing the short game and you have people who are playing the long game, right? We play the short game. We do what we have to do. And thinking ahead for us is like planning for, like, deciding what we want to eat for 2 days from now. You know what I mean? That's about the end of our attention span, right? Yes, I'm being facetious, but not by much. And if you look at somebody like what the Russians are doing, and I don't think that this is necessarily true under Putin, by the way, but certainly it's true for the Chinese communists. And not only that, but for the Muslim countries, they're playing a long game, right? So what we think about in terms of 15 minutes or an hour, these people are thinking in terms of hundreds of years. We'll just bide our time, right? In the various Gulf Wars, right, starting in the Persian Gulf War, 1991. I mean, the Arabs we were fighting had this saying, and it says, "You Americans have all the clocks, but we have all the time." Now that is a pretty darn good statement, you know. I like little anecdotes like that. And but the Russians were like, eventually the trend of things is going to bend in our favor, and the world is going to go to a one world socialist government, which was the point all along, you see. And you know, that is in a very macro sense what became in tactical forms the Cold War, you see, which we're going to get into in detail. All right, so all of the things that happened were our looking at our society and our culture and saying, well, I don't want to give up my individuality. My sense of Americanism and my rights under the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are going to tell me that I don't ever have to become subservient as a cog in some giant wheel, you see, which is what I'm asking to be do, but essentially, to just be part of something larger than myself, which I would do gladly upon my own accord. But now that you're coercing me to do it, I don't want to do it. You see, that's what you call an American, or that was a traditional sort of thing. I'm the most benevolent person in the world as an American, but as soon as you coerce me to do something, you're going to get some pushback from me, because now I'm concerned that if you could do that, you're going to take the rest of my civil liberties away, and you're just going to be telling me what to do about everything. See, and that's the tension that we have, even in our own internal Cold War, our own internal civil war, culturally. You see, and you got the micro and you got the macro. In our program over here, it's overlapping, the military aspects and the political and the geographical aspects of the Cold War. But all of these things are just tactical military events in the context of this larger philosophical dynamic. Or are we going to be an individual society that is going to have our own rights? Or are we going to be just part of some other larger thing that is going to be telling us what to do in the name of global socialism, which is being told is being done for our own good, even if we are lamenting what's being taken away from us. And then if it's being taken away from you and you resist, then you're being selfish because you don't care about the good of the world. You're only concerned about yourself. See? So, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm up to my eyeballs in this stuff, like every day. So, thoughts? So the whole thing's very philosophical. I mean, the Communist Manifesto it's philosophical. It's all philosophy, right? It's philosophy. It's like talking about Judaism. It's like talking about, it's like we were sitting here reading Thomas Aquinas. I mean, it's deep, it's philosophical. It is, you got to think about it, use some examples, and it's incredible that even things, and this is probably the best example of a doctrine that is fresh today. It's you can repackage this for any single generation, and it fits all purposes. It always has had an appeal. It always appeals to intelligent people, right? And it is very powerful, very long lasting, right? And it is yet to be seen if actually Karl Marx et al. And others, up to Lenin, actually were correct that eventually this entire arc is going to lead to the eventual one world socialist government. Okay, I mean, it's not an assurement that it won't happen. One of the biggest impediments of it happening was always been the United States of America, right? Because the United States of America stood unique, where we had a constitution for the American people that gave the American people these unassailable rights. You see, so there's been a lot of resistance for giving up what people think is their birthright vis-a-vis that, and subserving to any kind of external global government, like those fine fellows over in Brussels in the European Union and the United Nations. You see, so people are very, very skeptical of giving up what is guaranteed to you as an American citizen in the American Bill of Rights and the United States Constitution, when it seems like our own leaders at times are voluntarily giving away our own sovereignty and giving authority in various forms to other countries' authority. And people are saying, if you can do that, then you've just bypassed my constitutional rights. And you can't do that because you're elected to uphold the Constitution, not make the Constitution obsolete, you see? So this is a constant tension, constant tension. But the world, what I wanted to tell you today was, I think that more than anything, the Great Depression, with being preceded in real time by World War I and its aftermath, okay, was something that broke the back of the traditional world order. That was the point, that was a delineation point between the old world and modernism. Boom, right there. And nothing was ever going to be the same. Nothing, right? And everything that was assumed, everything that was traditional, everything that was Western, everything that was on sort of like this kind of like progressive flow chart from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, led to this catastrophe that was World War I, and then the Great Depression. And after that, it's kind of like, well, obviously that was the wrong thing to believe in, you know, let's go believe in something else. And that is why communism had such an effect, right? And still does, frankly. You know, I mean, communists can always look at, well, look at your form of government, look at capitalism, and see, I mean, are people equal? Are they, do they have the chance for what we're calling equality, right? As is enshrined in your founding documents, or is the whole thing just a scam? You know, and in 2022, we have this tremendous discussion right now between saying, well, it's not even equality that you want, which would suggest in our form of government as it still exists on our founding documents, that the average person is allowed the opportunity to pursue happiness, right? As in, like, AKA the Declaration of Independence, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So up to, I don't know, 10 years ago, that's where the focus was. The focus was on making sure that there was no exclusion for anybody because their gender, their race, their color, their background, to have an impediment to their pursuit of happiness, right? And then that's what we refer to as equality. Now we have a more socialist notion of equity, which is guaranteeing an equal outcome, which is actually much more aligned with communism, you see, because it says it's saying that the government should guarantee you equality, you see. So in other words, if that guy, I used the example before, the two cars, right? The guy across the street from you has got a better car than you, then somehow that's not equitable because you can't afford that car, and you should be able to afford that car, because after all, now you feel bad because you can't have that car. So now it's under equity, it's the government's responsibility to guarantee you happiness, not give you the opportunity to pursue happiness. It's a very, very important distinction, you see. So, you know, we've got the Cold War here on our sheet, you know, but we've got a cultural Cold War going on and a societal Cold War going on around us every day. Any thoughts here at this point? All right. I'm going to focus a lot on certainly World War II in our program, and then we'll get back to this in more details. I'll have some slides for you and some other things like that. I mean, it was a tremendous thing when we had it. All of this became on steroids because when we had now the advent of nuclear weapons, you know, now nuclear weapons, I mean, some of the conversations we're having, like this week about some of this stuff. I'll probably be talking about this stuff today in current events, or focus on contemporary issues about, I don't know, do you think that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons, right? You know, one of the interesting things about Vladimir Putin is that the fantasy was in 1991 that once the Soviet Union was gone, then, I mean, what's there left to fight about, you see? But in Vladimir Putin, you have the continuation of the policies that were the Soviet Union, right? In a Stalinist kind of a sense, without the communism. You see what I mean? So we thought that once the communism was gone, then that way of thinking that went along with the communism would be gone. But it isn't. You see, so we learned something even now, that you still have Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin still thinks just like Stalin did, communism and no communism. You see, so it's an important thing that we learned for anybody who's actually learning it, watching it right now. You see, So what we considered to be communism that drove us all crazy in the 20th century, we had a very poor way from the Western viewpoint of looking at where were the parameters of communism that were really disturbing to us. You see, now that became easy to identify in the immediate post-Cold War era, post-World War II era, because the Russians were vying for political influence with countries that were emerging nations, right? That, now that World War II was over, they're not, the Belgian Congo isn't the Belgian Congo anymore, that sort of a thing. You see, so the United States saw itself in the position to need to counter the influence of the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union wanted to go into a third world nation that wanted to emerge as its own independent nation and say, well, look, we'll give you technology, we'll build a power plant for you, we'll give you whatever you need, money, capital, technology. And there was only two stores in town that you could do that. It was the United States and the Soviet Union. And if you went with the Soviet Union, it was basically you were going to have to do their bidding politically. And everybody knows that. And the United States did not want that in our hemisphere. You see, we didn't want countries that were going to do Russia's bidding in our hemisphere, because that means that it was going to allow, Russian ships to build some naval base or something in our own hemisphere. And our own Monroe Doctrine was not going to allow that, right? And the Monroe Doctrine is pretty arrogant doctrine anyway. It says that from 1820, that now that the United States has emerged as a powerful enough position in the world, which was pretty ballsy stuff, considering that the United States was only a country for about 50 years at that point, right? And we basically flipped the middle finger at Europe and saying, hey, why don't you guys stay over there? Which the old world countries didn't appreciate very much, by the way. Now, that was pretty haughty of us, but we were confident. We had this whole continent, basically, we're almost the whole continent. And we were like, no, we're that good. So in other words, if anybody wants to have any political influence over here now at this point, the old world is over, this is a new world, and you better check with us first. Any of you countries that want to come over here and use military force. We're talking about North America, we're talking about South America, we're talking about the Caribbean. That was the Monroe Doctrine. And after World War II, the Monroe Doctrine was still in effect. You just listen to anything, you listen to the inaugural address of John F. Kennedy in 1960. It's filled with the Monroe Doctrine, you see? And it's filled with the tension between the United States and communism. About how we want to work with you, but we're not going to be subservient to you. And the Truman Doctrine itself, which was frankly never went away, okay, was that after World War II, every country that for instance, the Great Britain needed to wrap up its empire, right? In 1947-ish, 1948-ish, Great Britain was basically bankrupt at the end of World War II. And they were like, you know what, this whole thing with the empire, we can't afford that anymore. Let's just wrap it up. We don't need the gigantic navy anymore. We don't need the responsibility of running this whole empire. All you countries go do what you got to do, right? And even British mandated Palestine, which was this huge thing that was left to the control of the British as a result of the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. That was the British responsibility. That was a millstone around their neck from the day they were put in charge. The whole thing with the Jews and the Arabs and everything else. They're like, you know what, United Nations, here you go. Okay, but the point is that the British in 47 said, we're pulling out of our troops, our post-war garrison troops out of Turkey and Greece. This is to Harry Truman, and you know what's going to happen as soon as we pull out, don't you? Well, the Russians are going to just fill the vacuum, right in. So the United States, Harry Truman, he comes in, he gives a speech. Right, it becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. And he says that the United States will protect any country any people, wherever it is, against subjugation of their governments from outside powers. Now, who are we talking about? Without naming names, we're talking about the Russians, because the Russians, you see what Vladimir Putin just did in the eastern part of Ukraine? Right? Yes, you did. That's the answer. Just nod yes. It's the 4 regions where they had what we're referring to as these sham referenda, right? That's how you became a communist country after World War II, right? Basically, you had a gun put to your head, and it's like, would you like to be part of the Communist Party? And it's like, oh yeah, I think I would. Thank you very much. And next thing you know, it's like, hey, what do you know? This country wants to be part of Russia. You see, and you know, and that's what you had. And the whole tension behind the wall, right? The Iron Curtain was all of these countries had been essentially coerced into communist governments. You see, and that is what Harry Truman was terming governments that their governments had been subjugated from outside pressures against their own will. Right. So the Harry Truman, he committed the United States of America in 1947 to protect any country that Russia was going to go to and go in and put their own people in and flip the government. So 5 minutes later, they all of a sudden want to become part of the Russian Empire, you see, communist. And so we committed ourselves at that point in 1947 to a worldwide struggle, and that which led to everything, you know, all of these different proxy wars and everything else. You know, I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it or anything else like that, you know, but the blind spot that we had up till very recently is we didn't know the difference between, as I was just trying to describe, between like what it means to be a Russian in the Stalinist Vladimir Putin sense and what it means to be communist. You see, so if the Communist Manifesto says that we're looking to take over the whole world basically and make a one world socialist government, does that mean that if you're not communist but you're still Russian, that's still what you want to do? You see, so we had this thing that marked the Cold War, as I delineated it in our list, where it's kind of like if the North Vietnamese were going to invade South Vietnam, if the North Koreans were going to invade South Korea, was that at the hands of the Soviet Union? Was that at the hands of the Maoist Chinese? Are they all essentially one gigantic block that are sitting around a table deciding what's going to happen to the world? Or are they really separate entities that had their own differences? Right? We could not differentiate any of that, okay, back in those days. And really till the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, we saw the whole thing as one gigantic block, right? And if one hand was doing it, the whole hand was doing it, you see? And that is something with retrospect, we can make a big difference about understanding. And, you know, a lot of this kind of soul searching came when people were giving their mea culpas about Vietnam. You know, you have people like Robert McNamara, et cetera, like that. And they were like, in retrospect, right? Which is frankly the name of his book. And it said, you know, we just didn't know the difference. You know, we just didn't know the difference. If North Vietnam wanted this or they wanted the other thing, we just assumed that it was a whole communist world at play, you see. And therefore, that's why we have to stop it. Because if North Korea was going to take over the entire country of North Vietnam was going to take over the whole country of Vietnam, then that meant that it was another step in worldwide communism. You see what I mean? It wasn't an isolated thing. And we just could not see the difference. We couldn't see the difference. What do you think? Well, we're almost out of time. That's why I wanted to leave this with. That's why I wanted to leave this without the slides today. I wanted it to be more of an intellectual discussion. I can do that better without the slides. Sometimes slides are a distraction. You know, I'd rather just kind of do it right from here to your head. Any thoughts? Are we done?
Does no one have questions for Art? A lot of
Right.
information today.
Huh?
There was a lot of information today. I was hoping someone would have questions.
Sorry. Anyway, like I said, either I was being very effective or I already put everyone's like sleeping. So anyhow, like I said, I mean, it's like if we did this once a week forever, we would never cover the whole thing. But you can see that, we'll start off. That's why I wanted to start off today with the macro, and then we'll get in, and everything else that happened is really just a sort of like a tactical thing in context of the larger strategy, and how we perceive the strategy. So it's how the Russians perceived it, how the communists perceived it, right? And the Maoists perceived communism completely different than Stalin did. Trotsky saw it differently than Lenin did. I mean, it was, so we'll go backward and we'll see what the differences actually were. And but in retrospect, in real time, we saw the whole thing as one giant block. It became a binary thing. It was either a 0 or a 1. That's all we saw.
Well, thank you so much again, Art, for another one of your sessions.
My pleasure.
Again, last call if anyone has any questions for Art before we wrap up.
Okay.
Okay.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me, everyone.
Thank you
Excellent.
for coming today. And I just want to take a moment and thank the Friends of the Library for making this series possible and having Art come out here every week to intrigue us with his knowledge and stories and everything. So the next session will be October 19th at 2 p.m. And I hope I'll see you all then. You have a great day. Thank you so much, Art.
Bye-bye now. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.